be seated. Merry Christmas. Isn't Jesus wonderful? So, Christmas time again. Time to celebrate the birth of our Savior, reason for our salvation, and our one-day entry into heaven. So for this year's Christmas sermon, I want to speak to you on the most classic of Christmas sermon topics. Is Die Hard a Christmas movie? I'm kidding. Any sane person knows it is. Now, it is. No, what I meant to say was the classic topic of the psychological concept of self-sabotage. I know, you're like, what? I love raising eyebrows and curiosity. Now, before you think, what does this have to do with Christmas, Pastor Stephen? Well, let me tell you, we're going to find that out together right now. You get to watch me self-sabotage this sermon to teach you something important. No, you're welcome. So you might think that self-sabotage is an odd topic for Christmas sermon, but you might be surprised. Let me explain what it is a bit. It's a fairly generic overview. It occurs in multiple ways for multiple reasons. It isn't always done the same way. I've seen this happen with a lot of people I know, and they set themselves up for failure and sabotage their own success. I don't know if anyone's ever seen this happen. I'm sure you have if you think about it. I've thought it myself. Why would a person want to sabotage their own success? Why would a person set themselves up for failure? Those are good questions. Reasons for self-sabotage range from a fear of success, a fear of rejection, sense of unworthiness, what's called psychological homeostasis, which is a fancy way of saying that change is scary, so you want things to stay the same. And let me give you some examples. So, self-sabotage. Sometimes people self-sabotage their relationships. They push the person away, they give the other person reasons to leave, try to force them out. They may cheat, they may act cruelly or rudely, push the other person's buttons, etc. They figure the person's just going to leave anyway. Everyone seems to leave them, so they might as well just make it happen. If the person won't leave, or you don't want to go down those routes, you pull a Chandler Bing, where you simply nitpick something about the other person as an excuse to end it yourself. So you'll find reasons, it's just excuses, but like, this isn't just working, we aren't clicking, it isn't you, it's me, I hate you. Or the classic, what do you mean it's not a Christmas movie? That's it, we're done. This way, they don't have to be vulnerable with somebody because they fear the risk of hurt that comes with that vulnerability. Sometimes self-sabotage takes the form of addiction. Some people, they think of addiction, and most people will think of alcohol, drugs, gambling, or pornography. But the truth is, addiction can be anything. It can be food or caffeine. It can be prescription drugs, not just illicit drugs. We see this with the opioid crisis. It can be video games, TVs, movies, books. It can be internet addiction. It can be sex or cars or sports. Smartphones is the most popular current one. See, truthfully, people are addicted to serotonin and dopamine releases, and they seek it, and they can become addicted to that. And the brain will actually eventually rewire to need it, whether they do or not. You could be addicted to shopping, for instance. You can be addicted to the feeling of a new thing because it gives you that release. That wears off, so you need another new thing. It could be addiction to new relationships. You jump around because you like the high that comes from a new relationship. Addiction can be a form of self-sabotage because it keeps you from achievement, keeps you down, keeps you failing, keeps you from changing or moving forward. The hard truth is there's usually an underlying reason why you avoid these things. Something you're trying to get away from, something you're trying to hide, something you're trying to bury in yourself, and addiction is an escape from it. That's why the concept of drinking to forget is even a phrase that we use. Number 3, some people sabotage their success at work. And even when I say self-sabotage, it's interesting because they always have an excuse and a rationale to support what they're doing. And it's never their fault. They rarely ever admit to doing it because they just want to sabotage themselves. The rationalization is actually a form of victimization, where the person also wants to be the victim. I know you've never met anyone like this in your life. A person cannot be to blame for their own issues, so it goes hand in hand. A person will stay up late, for instance, knowing that they have to wake up early the next day, but then not wake up and be late. Maybe hoping they get fired, they don't have to work there anymore. Maybe they don't like the loss of freedom that comes from having a job. Sometimes, number 4 is they'll engage in riskier behavior that increases the likelihood of something like sickness or injury. Similar to staying up late, sometimes this sabotage will be undercutting themselves in productivity at work, turning in paperwork late or incomplete, making what seems like simple mistakes. The truth is, they don't want to be there, but they can't bring themselves to quit. 5, sometimes people sabotage themselves by spending all their money. This is riskier behavior. Just as an example, they may maintain a certain order of life or stay how they like it. Some people actually like staying on state support and state insurance and food stamps for their entire lives, for instance, instead of just letting it be a help for a moment. So in order to stay that way, they'll sabotage their own interviews, their own health, their own finances, make poor decisions, never fighting for more. They won't admit blame, so there's always a reason. There's a rationale that goes on in the mind. A lot of times. Something, the boss always hates me. They're always out to get me. The system's against me. They'll sabotage their own success. Another form can include negative self-talk, where you simply put yourself down, self-deprecating. You're always projecting your own feelings and inadequacies and the judgment of others back onto yourself. So you never have to have a drive to achieve. You aren't worthy. You rationalize your own failures away by just not being good enough or smart enough or strong enough or pretty enough. Another one, I had a chart that has all these. Another one is procrastination, where you simply delay the task. You wouldn't think of this one necessarily, but over and over again, you just push it off until you fail. You wait because you fear rejection or denial so much, you just never turn in the request. You push it off so they can't say no because you never turned it in. It's not your fault. It tends to stem from a lack of self-worth or value. You don't think you deserve it. Another one, which may surprise you, is perfectionism. You wouldn't think of this one, but psychologically, perfectionism is a result of pressure to perform and having high standards projected on you. It's also a consistent indecisiveness that can be caused by this because of this fear of failure. And that, if you fail in your mind, will lead to rejection, could lead to loss of love, because you've learned that to be accepted, you must perform at a certain level. These can be classic signs of self-sabotage, especially with perfection, because in a way it's like the opposite of negative self-talk. You believe you can do better, go beyond, but actually you're using it as an excuse to procrastinate. And things are never good enough. I can be better. It's not perfect enough. I remember someone that, this wasn't what he was doing, but it just reminds me of someone I went to school with, and if he wrote a sentence out and he made a mistake anywhere in there, he would erase the entire sentence and start over. It had to be perfect. Everything has to be ordered in such a way that it's never truly finished when it gets to this level, so they can never fail. And there can be other causes for a lot of these issues, don't get me wrong. Part of a psychologist's job is to help parse that out with you. Now don't misunderstand, there are multiple ways that these same symptoms show up. There's crossover. This is just how they relate to self-sabotage. It all stems from core feelings of low self-worth, fear of rejection, fear of failure, fear of loss of love, and trauma. And trauma is a big one. And psychologically, it tends to create the others. We have what's called nodal events, N-O-D-A-L. And these are events that create or incite certain behaviors. They're big changes in life. These can be weddings, or births, or deaths, or new jobs, or loss of job, or graduations, or injuries, or new relationships, or breakups of an old one. Any big life change. Some you don't consider, some you do. They can be many things, but they trigger behavioral changes. You'll find that everyone has these events, and their responses are the copes we see in things like self-sabotage. It's a coping mechanism because the trauma of the event, for one reason or another, pushes you into a dark and anxious place. And it created in you the need to protect yourself. And therefore, you rationalize your behaviors. So what I mean is the traumatic event drive a person to avoid it later down the road. So let's say you have a bad breakup with somebody because the relationship was abusive, which was traumatic for you. You may then self-sabotage your next relationship out of fear that it'll become that. Or you may avoid them altogether because you're afraid this will happen. A lot of our defense mechanisms are exactly that. That's what they are. They're methods of coping developed to protect ourselves and keep us from having to face, frankly, the reality of what caused it in the first place. And that is self-sabotage in a nutshell. So when we look at the Bible, we see a lot of examples of good behavior and bad behavior, don't we? One of the things I've tried to teach all of you over and over is that in every biblical situation is to look at cultural context and to understand how it connects. The whole Bible is written in a way that connects to everything else in the Bible. But all of these things build on each other, and the psychology of the situation is crucial to your understanding of it. And to bring that into any biblical situation, the cultural psychology, the personal psychology, the family psychology, the religious psychology, this is something we did when we looked at the 7 cities, 7 letters. And all of those drive the behaviors you see in the Bible. Believe it or not, you will see forms of self-sabotage in the Bible. You don't need to recognize them. And this is because most of the time when we look at the Bible, we look at it very spiritually. And nothing wrong with that. It is a spiritual text and spiritual guide. But we tend to lose sight of the humanity behind the people. We do this with others too, where we just can't seem to separate the sin from the person. And we start to become a little too harsh and too judgmental because all we see is the problems about that person. And we lose sight of the person that's hurting on the other side. It's a book about human history and human behavior due to the human sin and the need for a savior. That's what the Bible is. The Bible is always accurate, but just because it's in the Bible doesn't mean it's proper behavior. Okay? It isn't okay to do something just because the patriarchs did it. It's not okay to lie just because Abraham does it a few times. Fear is not okay because we see Gideon and Elijah deal with it. Murder is not okay because King David did it, or adultery or manipulation. These are real people in real events driven by real internal needs and pressures to perform, emotions coming from past trauma and abuse, and it pushed them to a place that they should have never been in. It can create a need for validation and a lack of it. It can create a fear of not receiving it and being let down again. And this, in turn, creates a drive to avoid situations where approval is key, hence self-sabotage. No human is really meant to be in some of the places we as humans end up. We hear things and see things and do things that, frankly, we were never meant to. But sin has driven us to that point. And it messes with us. It creates issues in our minds. No one in the Bible, outside of Jesus, is perfect. Only Jesus, his Father, and the Holy Spirit of God are perfect. Everything else can or is flawed. So everyone you read about fails. Humans fail. It is our innate tendency. Think about it. Even in the garden, living in perfection, with every need met in ways we cannot have them met today, literally walking with the God of creation by your side every evening like two friends, and Adam still sinned. And that can lead down a totally different theological argument. He still sinned. He wasn't deceived. We're told that. Yet he still did it. Even when we look at the culture of the day, we tend to look at this, they're full of negative behavior. But we typically never look at the reason and psychology behind it. Why are they full of this behavior? It gives you an appreciation for the person as a person, but it also helps us carry out the other part of Christianity, which is to love. When we look back in the Bible, we tend to take the cultural piece sometimes. It tends to be a shallow overview. And we don't push it far enough to really make the ideas click into place so that you understand the story. It's important to understand the culture of the day and the society they lived in just as much as we understand ours today. Because what we do is we take that story and we bring it to today. And we try to filter it through our lens and our mindset and our rationale and our reasoning and how it would fit into our culture. But the problem is, sometimes we could not be more different than the cultures these people come from, especially as Christians today, modern American Christians. Sometimes those other cultures are so foreign. And sometimes we don't appreciate how much of a bubble we live in, especially in America, compared to everyone else. And you'll find that when we look at our culture, Christians will make compromises as to what they feel they should do or not do, based entirely on how culture views it today. Sins have suddenly become acceptable because the culture wants to accept them. The world wants that sin, and because they want it, we as Christians feel we have to compromise to give it to them. We disguise it as love, as acceptance, as Christ-like, and we virtue signal our way right off of the straight and narrow path. At the same time, our human natures want the same thing the world wants. Truthfully, we want sin. We can tell ourselves we don't, but we do. It's our nature. We have two. And that other nature is always there, and it wants sin. So the chance to okay it in somebody else means it okays us in us. So if we can justify other people's sins, we can also shift the blame. You can't say anything to me, they're doing this, and that's okay. See, and all the sins start to not be so bad because we have comparison. And this creates a cognitive dissonance. What that means is a discongruity, where there's a lack of harmony or consistency. And this occurs because our two natures, between them, there is what we know we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to live, and it's at odds with the way we want to live. Paul explains it in Romans 7:15 through 20 when he says, "For what I am doing I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I don't practice. But what I hate, that I do. If then I do what I," we'll change the word, "want not to do, I agree with the law that it's good. But now it is no longer I who do it, but the sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For the will is present in me, but how to perform what is good, I do not know. For the good that I want to do, I do not do. But the evil I don't want to do, I do. That I practice. Now, if I do what I don't want to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me." He's looking at the natures here. So he's got two natures, and one nature really wants to do these things. And the reality is, he still messes up. And there's things that he wants to do, but truthfully, without God, he has no way. So you can know what's right and wrong. You can see people that are not Christian know what's right and wrong, but they do not have the capacity to truly achieve it. With God, they do. And he says, but even still, what I want to do, I don't always do. Because that sin is in me. We try to compromise and get both. Sigmund Freud described it this way with ego, superego, and the id, where you know what you're supposed to do and what you've been taught to do. But there's also your nature that just wants to do what it wants. And then there's a place in the middle where we merge the two and try to make both sides happy. Okay? Paul tells us that the sin is to be dead to us, and that sin nature is almost foreign to him now. He is a spiritual person. He wants to do well, but he doesn't always know how. Now that he does, his flesh is still sinning. He's got his spirit and his flesh, and they're at odds. What does any of this have to do with the Bible or Christmas, Pastor? Well, I'm glad you asked again. Have you ever wondered why the Jews rejected Jesus? I mean, we have our answers, we have our thoughts, and I'm sure if I ask, I could get a bunch of answers. Most of them are assumptions, if we really look at them. And we can't just say, well, it was prophesied, because that removes their volition and their guilt. Jesus wouldn't punish them for rejection if there was simply some overriding force that made them do it. When we look at the Old Testament, and you read through your Old Testament, you'll notice that history just stops. After the Italian book of Malachi, it just stops. And we jump from around 400 BC to 4 BC, the birth of Christ. And then we jump to around 8 BC, and then we jump to 25 BC. And this period between 400 and 4 is marked by a complete lack of communication, it seems, where God has stopped talking through the prophets. Now, he gave prophets like Daniel to tell us what happens during that window, but it was done beforehand. Nothing comes in that window. It seems that God speaks to no one of consequence during this period that we have recorded. So let's look at it. Babylon had captured Israel, and then Persia takes over Babylon. The Persian king sends the Jews that want to go back home to rebuild and restore Jerusalem. It's a third of the 3 decrees like this. During this period, the temple had been destroyed, their relics were lost, and treasures were sacked and looted. This places the Jews, into a whole new system, right? A whole new government, a whole new world, a whole new religious system, new currency, new everything. It's during this time that Esther happens. They're in a whole new place with all new rules. And all of a sudden, there's a serious risk of their death. And the story of Esther is how God works that out. But what happens is they gain new protections, don't they? The story of Esther is how the Jews are kept safe even during exile. Most of the Jews embraced the law and adhered to it religiously during this time because, see what I did there? Religiously. Because they'd lost everything they had. This was the only way for them to maintain their identity, because all the identifiers were lost. They no longer had the temple, right? All they had was God's word. They knew God had let this happen. They had lost the promised land, they lost the temple, they lost their very way of life, they lost their ways to worship him and to have sin forgiven. Because remember, without the temple, there's no sacrifice, right? The Jews that returned to Israel were extremely legalistic at this point in time and a cultural shift. Okay, so there's a map here. So Greece rises to power in 800 BC. And its zenith, in the next slide, is 330 BC. And so it goes from all these little trim countries to all of that. Okay? Alexander groups them all together. This leads to a lot of shifting of power and culture, and Greek culture dominates the whole area, creating a new main language for everyone. New beliefs, new rulers, new taxes, and civic responsibilities. So by the time Jesus is born, the Greek world is the world. Okay? Names change, but the Greek world was the world as everyone knew it. It stretches from Egypt to the Mediterranean and to Western India. He had a large empire. All of the basics of human expression and exploration, art, science, religion, philosophy, language, all of it, were then Greek. And it formed a one-world government and civilization that directed everything around it. Alexander combined them all but died, and his 4 generals split the kingdom. And so, in the next one, it's a little hard to see, but you got 1, 2, 3, and 4. Blue, green, orange, pink. So you get 4. Each general got a section, okay? By the time Jesus is born, there's only 2. Seleucid over here, and Ptolemaic right there and there, okay? Those were the 2 main ones. Now, the Roman Republic's already there. It's growing. It had taken over one of the general's territories. The other one was absorbed by the Seleucid Empire. The Ptolemaic just stays there. Now that's Egypt and all of its rulers, like Cleopatra. They were all Greek. They had ruled Egypt for a long time. The Hebrews had their right to worship protected and could largely operate how they wished as long as taxes and loyalty were to the Greek government. And they changed hands a lot between different kingdoms. But at this point, you're dealing with these two. And they would shift between these two kingdoms because Israel and that territory became a buffer zone. It was kind of a neutral territory. And it kind of depended on the time point where who owned what. But it was kind of a neutral territory with Ptolemaic interest at this point. And so the Magi come from the Seleucid Empire. They're enemies. So when these guys show up with, you're talking 500 or more people, not just 3 guys. They show up with full guard, all their people, into enemy territory. This is why everybody was on alert. This is a big deal. Why are you coming here? Everyone knew about them. But anyway, the Jews were still considered lesser in their beliefs and culture because Greek culture is considered the prime example of human achievement at this point in time. Okay? This was until 168 BC, when Hellenist ruler Antiochus IV gained control over the Seleucid throne. He opposed the Jewish people in new ways. We've discussed him before. He really hated how they just wouldn't get with the program and saw it as a direct challenge to his greatness, though this was mainly due to his problems with Egypt. He had his ego bruised, so he took it out on the Jews. He would not tolerate this challenge and took it as far as forcing the building of idols on their land, even the temple's Holy of Holies, and slaughtering a pregnant sow on the altar. He plundered most of their cities. He killed their people who refused to bow, forcing them to build new temples. When they would resist, he would slaughter the men, the women, the children to get back in line. This did not happen to the Samaritans, their neighbors, who pretty much aligned with them and didn't cause them any problems, which is one good reason they really hate them later, if you always wondered why there was a problem. All of this shifting and turmoil leads to the Maccabean or Hasmonean revolt, when a prominent Jewish family rises up to stand against the armies of Antiochus and won a bunch of battles. It was really led by one of his sons, because he was a priest, he's an aging priest, Judas the Hammer Maccabeus. That's his name. He held the heavyweight WWE title for many years after defeating the armies at SummerSlam 164 BC. This leads to a major cleanup job in Jerusalem and the temple, and they have a huge party, and they rededicated the temple in what's known as the Festival of Lights, or Hanukkah. Okay? This is called the Winter Festival. It's actually mentioned in John. Jesus goes to it. They don't name it, but he does mention it exists. So the Maccabean revolt caused the leaders of them and the Seleucids to agree to a peace treaty where the Jews would be allowed to worship as they wished. This ended because of Antiochus' death. And the Seleucids would retain control of the territory. So as time passed, religious safety is secured for them by intensifying their legalism. Okay? It's a way of maintaining strict control because the Jews vividly recalled the persecution during exile and vowed to never let it happen again. And since to them God was remaining silent, they made a lifestyle of chasing a heightened piety like never before by protecting the Old Testament law and cracking down more and more on anything they deemed got in the way of them and God. Gradually, these more pious among them elevated themselves to the station of self-appointed guardians of virtue, identifiers of sin and public correction committees within the community. And Hellenistic Jews butted heads with these conservative Jews who saw the Hellenist as compromising with the secular world. This led to civil wars, okay? And these conflicts contributed to the rise of the Roman Empire because it was the weakness during these times that they capitalized on. So eventually, Rome gets all that territory, funny enough. under the Roman general Pompey. However, the history of the clashes between the Jewish sect led to a fragmentation of the people. They were once united under Yahweh, and they were no longer. Okay? They were no longer one people. Hellenistic Jews had introduced new forms of Jewish worship. There was no longer one way to God. As we go through this, you're going to find a lot of similarities to today. There was no longer a centralized Mosaic form of worship, and it took on many varying forms. As Rome rises to power between 136 and 141 BC, the Greek culture was too embedded, and so it was absorbed. There was no new culture. Rome just renamed everything. They really wanted to be Greek anyway, so it's fine. Rome ruled with an iron fist, though. They did not allow dissension, and Rome was able to re-engage a one-world order at this point through peace accords and tight control, and they create a larger version of Alexander's Greek Empire. This forced a change that we see today. See if this sounds familiar. It created a truly multi-ethnic, culturally diverse people all living in the same kingdom. What happens is their loyalties become divided. And this causes Jews to divide into groups. You've seen the name Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes and Zealots and words like this, but we don't really appreciate them. They're just thrown in there because they assume you know who we're talking about. How many people actually know what these groups are and how, what we're talking about? Not many. So real briefly, it starts with Hasidism. And this was the natural reaction, to how secular the rest of the Jews had become. Much like the Hasidic Jews came out of Talmudic Judaism today. It's a response because they felt they got too far off. This movement was led by the more strict and more pious Jewish priests who maintained devout lives under the Mosaic law and devoted themselves to studying the Torah. Because of their obsessive adherence, they were considered the most legalistic of the Jews. It creates a strong judgmental dislike of anyone who wasn't like them, even those in their rank who they didn't think were as strict as them. I know no one's ever run into people like that. This went far beyond the requirements of the Tanakh, They originally sprang from a good place. This is the group the Pharisees came from. They were not evil men, contrary to how we usually view them. These men were incredibly devout to what they believed was God's way and God's word. The name Pharisee literally means those who are separated. And they took the idea of sanctification to heart. They knew the Jews were meant to be God's witnesses through extreme separation. See, the law was designed to run counter to everything the world had taught you. And so the idea was it took everything that the world said brought you power and respect and wealth, and God forbid it all. And he made a very tight, controlled, separated society. So idol worship to gain power, gone. Stealing, lying, gone. Sacrifices, gone. Perverse worship, gone. So to the rest of the world, they're nuts. Because this is how we are what we are. Do you not want to live long? Right? But to God, what he's saying is, I can remove all of that from these people. They have no access to everything you think gives them power, and they will still have more than you. They will still have better lands, better blessing, better everything. Because the true path to that power, to those resources, is through me. And he's showing that's the whole point. So that they would then show the world what God could bring them. But because there was all these things out there that they thought brought them power, we have to remove them all so that you see that this is the way forward. Okay? So their devotion, the Pharisees' devotion, was honorable. We could learn from them. The problem ended up being that their focus on religion and man's attempts to please themselves overtook the point of the law, and they lost it. What's interesting is the Pharisees were primarily made up of the middle class, just laymen, which is kind of surprising considering the influence we see they have. They had championed the priest authority. The Jewish book, the Midrash, which is sort of study guide or commentary on the law, was their brainchild. And the scribes were usually from the Pharisees. Their job changed over time. Old Testament scribes like Ezra were similar to what you'd call a secretary today. Someone who keeps excellent records, organizes important documents. By the time of the New Testament, this had shifted to involve copying, studying, and interpreting the books of the law instead, much like our medieval monks. The culture during the New Testament days actually thought of scribes like lawyers, not like what we thought of with Ezra. And because they spent an inordinate amount of time interpreting the Tanakh, their word became law to the Jews who followed them. This is partially why, when you see Jesus walking among the people, the oral law or traditions of the Jews play such a major role. Because it wasn't about the book, it was about the interpretation of the book, okay? Because the world was changing so rapidly with the spread of Hellenism, the modern sins and problems that they were running into weren't covered directly. Does that sound familiar? Wasn't covered directly by, like the internet's not mentioned in the Bible. So we reinterpret the old to make it modern. And this is what they started doing. So they began to interpret the law in modern terms. They felt the need to remain relevant to the culture around them, whether that was a true need or not. And it caused them to value the oral traditions over the law, where it became a prerequisite for the Pharisees, and eventually replaced the law altogether, which is what the Talmud does today. So even though not every scribe was a Pharisee, every scribe's word was final on matters of the law. And the Pharisees prized the law above all, so they were often mentioned together. Then there's the Essenes, who stem from the same movement. They didn't believe in reforming culture and society. Again, see if this sounds familiar. Instead, they left society altogether and dispersed into small communities in wild, unpopulated areas. They believed God would change people, so they didn't have to be involved. They believed it would just happen anyway. They could be considered even more focused on holiness than the Pharisees, but because they kept to themselves, no one really cared. They stayed out of their way, so you don't see them mentioned much. John the Baptist is considered an Essene. We think he came from that community. And the reason is because his wild, unkept appearance and his unwavering sermons are exactly what we know of them. The Dead Sea Scrolls were made by the Essenes. Okay. Then there's the Zealots. They started about the same time as the Pharisees, and they're the opposite. Their theological and religious roots are comparable. They liked to stay away like the Essenes, but what made them different was they were willing to change society by force. That's what they thought. They refused to pay taxes. They didn't follow government rules. They radically opposed Rome, and their goal was to see it overthrown. They were the anarchists of the Jews. Idolatry was the absolute worst to them, and this comes from what they tracked themselves all the way back to Phinehas in Numbers 25, 7 through 13. They believed God should be defended zealously, even if it meant death. Righteous vengeance was not a problem. Remember Simon, the zealot of the 12, Luke 6:15. Now, while the Pharisees were the most powerful sect in the villages around Jerusalem, the Sadducees were the most influential in Jerusalem. They were the 1%ers. They were the wealthy, aristocratic, upper-class Jews, and they viewed themselves as the inheritors of the will of the Maccabees. So their job was to resist the government and any threats to Hebrew society. But what this ended up being is they were the authority politically and spiritually in Jerusalem. And they were also the Jewish spokesmen that mediated between Rome and Israel. Not everyone liked them. They didn't try to please people at all. And they mixed religion and politics in most of their verdicts. It didn't matter, though, if you didn't like them, because they were the high rankers and they were the heads of the Jewish court system in Jesus' day. So even though they weren't super loyal to the Jewish concepts of purity or tradition, like the Pharisees, they made the decisions. But they did it with Rome in mind, which seems counterintuitive, but it's what they did. They're supposed to oppose them, but they made sure that they were minded. They didn't believe in the supernatural. They didn't believe in angels or resurrection, which made them sad, you see. It's cheesy, but it's how you can remember it. They ignored the Tanakh except for the law. Only it mattered and defined them. They lived a chosen approach They never tried to convert anyone because they believed that those people were already them. So it didn't matter. If you weren't 1% like them, it didn't matter. Then you have the Hellenistic Jew. They were more liberal in their stances. And this was a large amount of the Jews who were simply a product of their system. This system being hundreds of years of cultural shifts and adaptations since Alexander. To drive the point home, let me ask all of you, how much has the United States changed in the last 20 years? How much has it changed in your lifetime? Okay. Imagine how much it changed in the last 200 years since we started. We look back at these founding fathers, but I don't know how easy it would be to relate to them. Their mindsets were quite a bit different than ours. They were very much opposed to government by force. And even when people claim it, they don't really do it that much. Now, this is one country. Shoot, look back at when Bill Clinton was in office and what he and Hillary said as policies and compare to the same today. They're a complete opposite, okay? They liked closed borders, believe it or not. They liked lower taxes. These are the things they got elected on. And now look at them. Or look at JFK and what the policies he ran on as a Democrat, and then look today. With these Jews, we're not discussing 20 years, we're not discussing 60 years, we're not discussing 200 years, we're discussing 400 years under 3 different nations of influence, aside from previous rulers. I want you to understand the stance and their starting point. So the Hellenists, their ancestors were almost always tracked back to the intermarriage of Israelites who did not come back from Persia. See, we missed this, but when they came back to Persia, it was only the ones who wanted to go back with Nehemiah. The rest didn't. A lot of them stayed. And those continued in a secular world, and they intermarried. So most of these Jews live in distant foreign lands. They dropped rites of circumcision and different rites, and then they didn't even speak Aramaic a lot of the time. One such settlement just outside of Judea is said to have formed as a direct result of intermarriage between the Assyrians and the northern kingdom was the Samaritans. And the Samaritans were raised worshiping both Yahweh and all the Assyrian gods together. They had a mix of Yahweh, Judaism, and Assyria, okay? They mixed them, and that was not weird. Remember, everybody did this. The Jews were the only ones who didn't. So we look and we think, wow, that's weird. That's our perspective. The rest of the world's like, you're weird. So they practiced the belief of in Yahweh, but similar, but they believed that Mount Gerizim was the true holy mountain to worship him on, which we see mentioned with Jesus and the woman in John 4. In their defense, this mount was important for getting blessings. When they entered the promised land initially, they were to stand on one of 2 mountains, one for blessing and one for curse. And that's in Deuteronomy 11:29 and Joshua 8:33. The beginning of the hostility between these two was never really tracked down, but a good part of it was that they were mixed, and another good part of it, which they probably wouldn't have cared about by this time, except remember, they never got tortured or persecuted under Antiochus. So they saw them as sellouts and traitors. Then you have the Sanhedrin, and the Sanhedrin was the Jewish civil court. When reading most versions, the word council or court is about them. This institution was hard to trace, but it's supposed to have come from Moses' 70 elders back in Numbers 11:16 through 24, which makes it pretty old. So by the New Testament, the Sanhedrin community group of 7 men or more, and they met in various synagogues. The Sanhedrin in Jerusalem was 71 scribes and elders, with both Pharisees and Sadducees being welcomed, but most were Sadducees, including the high priest. The Sanhedrin did not have the right to condemn a criminal to death because Jacob prophesied in Genesis 49:10 that the scepter or right to rule would pass when the Messiah is born. Now it's funny because that happens right at that window when Jesus is born, and Rome removes their right to kill. And all the priests ripped their clothes and moaned and wailed and covered themselves in sackcloth because the Messiah wasn't there. And Jacob's prophecy must have failed. Rome now decides who to kill. Rome didn't care. They avoided Jewish disputes, and there was a certain level of autonomy in their court system except for the death penalty. And so what they do is they'd recommend it to the Romans, but they'd have to decide. That's what you see happens with Jesus. And you may consider, okay, why did you go through all this history? It's simply to make clear to you, this is the point. The Old Testament Jews, the Jews that we think of when we think of this, no longer existed. These are not Old Testament Jews. None of the people and how they lived back then existed. That system was gone. That's the point. There's all these groups, there's all these ways of thought. None of them lined up with the old way. This is the world Jesus comes into. A world where everything is completely different. A world that's a lot like ours today. They mirror a lot of how the church segregates and behaves in various ways. We're no longer discussing an isolated collective of traditional Jewish people and beliefs. They are no longer the people trained to wait for the Messiah. They had very specific expectations of him when he showed up, which is all selective readings anyway. Due to the persecution, the self-worth problems, their trauma, their fear of rejection, their fear of failure, and perfectionism, they made concessions and compromises. They'd accepted the ideals of larger cultures and lost their way because of it. They still retained their very proud nature, but they were self-sabotaging their own future. And they were making their way straight out of God's favor and into rejecting their Messiah. They were either too strict and lost the heart of the law, worried too much about the details, or they weren't strict enough to ever have the heart of the law to begin with. They held their own expectations of the how, the when, and the why of God's plan. When he didn't measure up, they didn't want him. Because it was no longer about becoming what God wants, it's about God being what we want. And that's what they did. The manger is the craziest way to save the world. Think about it. It's the craziest plan. Well, the Messiah is going to save the world. How's he going to save the world? He's going to die. He's going to be born in a manger with animals. I'm sorry, what? How does this plan make any sense? He's not riding in with armies? No. But that's what they'd done. They read very selective sections. All of that was told to them in the Old Testament. They just ignored it. They wanted the one that would overthrow these people who they hated. They wanted a God who would do what they wanted, the way they wanted it. I know we never do that. And so we reject the God that doesn't do what we want. We get mad when it's not met to our standard. Many simply couldn't change. When the Messiah shows up, they needed that psychological homeostasis. They couldn't change. They didn't see how. This is how they've been. Even if that means hell, I can't change. I'm too scared. I'm too afraid. We could easily point fingers at them as if we do any better. But do we? Truthfully? Christians have some pretty self-sabotaging behaviors. We often do things that ruin our witness and lessen our responsibility, hoping that we don't have to do as much. We could receive the Holy Spirit more fully and take the world, but that takes work. We aren't really worthy of that. God and his people will expect more out of me if I show up. We sin, we compromise, we battle the flesh, and it keeps us where we are. Maybe it's a lack of appreciation for the blood that he spilled for us. Maybe it's a misunderstanding of our value in him. Maybe it's a lack of faith in him and his plan to protect us and bless us if we put ourselves out there. Maybe it's negative self-talk that drives us to avoid him, thinking he can do anything with us. He can't do anything with us. Maybe it's people-pleasing with a martyr complex. No real faith or heart underneath it, leading to burnout and bitterness. Maybe it's perfectionism, claiming that the lack of perfection proves it isn't from God. Even when it is. It's us that aren't perfect, not him. Maybe it's a lone wolf syndrome. It causes us to stay away from other Christians. And those Christians that would help us grow and would push us to be better and closer to him, and we avoid them. Whatever the case, Jesus came to a world steeped in exactly that same situation. He came to a group that had lost its way due to idolatry for a good cause. That's what we'll call it. Where their own cares overtook God's importance in their lives and made them self-centered and self-righteous, which also made them impossible to please and impossible to reach or save. They wouldn't allow it. And many times we do this in the church. The world is counting on us. We are how Jesus reaches the world. It isn't just Jesus we let down, but a world of hurting and lost people that we never reach because we can't see past our own issues enough to trust God while we work to reach them. And you know what? This is the perfect time of year to do it. And this is the point I'll close on. He is wonderful. He's always wonderful. But this time of year, we put our focus on how wonderful he really is. This is when the majority of the world celebrates a festival that, contrary to the belief of many, was not originally pagan, but was a widely agreed upon point of the year to celebrate. At this point in the year, over 90% of people admit that Christmas is about the birth of Jesus. Over 90%. Now, whether you like it or not, he took those roots, no matter what they were, and gave the whole world a day to recognize his birth. He literally handed it to us. They know what the day's about. He gave us a day when we can say, this is what the holiday is really about, and everyone agrees. Then he made it super easy for us to talk about him because they know that's the point. It's not weird for Jesus to show up at Christmas. Even if it was, for the sake of argument, pagan, it would match Romans 8:28 through 30, which says, and we know all those things work together for good to those who love the Lord, to those who are called according to his purpose, for whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, he also called. Who he called, he justified. And who he justified, he also glorified. He turned the evils of the devil and the plans to corrupt this into the good for his people, just like we see in Genesis 50:20. That's what Joseph tells. He took the persecution that we went under as Christians and gave us safe spaces and laws to protect our religious freedom. Some see that as a bad thing. It's not. Our response to what he has done may be bad. We may get lazy, but that does not make the system bad. We may decide to rest on our laurels, but that's our fault, no one else's. We may decide to stop trying, but that is not why he turned it around for us. He turned it around to give us the freedom and access to share him with the world. All of the kingdoms of the world were shifted. So the Greek kingdom could come in, unite the world, give them one language that everyone spoke. One system, one methodology. Rome came in and built roads to all of those places. So by the time Paul goes out, he has access to everywhere and he can communicate with everyone. God made it perfect. It was timed for the birth of the church. And we have the same thing today. We can go anywhere in the world. Just book a flight. Half the time you don't even need it. Just hop on your computer. You can talk to people online. He set up a protective situation not to make us weak, to provide us with a safe haven, a headquarters to protect his own while we seek the lost for him. He gave us this not to surrender to the devil and to the naysayers and to the unsaved, sinfully minded individuals who seek to remove God from human lives, but as a way to help us stand firm, safely, and prepare for the fights that we will have to fight. This time is the biggest holiday in the world for a reason, not because of commercialization, not because of propaganda, because Halloween has that and it's never beat Christmas. but because this holiday is about Jesus. And the world even admits that. Why throw that away? Why? Why attack what he's given us, even if you just don't want presents? Why risk becoming just like the Pharisees were during his time, who became so staunch in religiosity that they missed the Messiah who walked among them, became so wrapped up in how holy we perceive ourselves to be that we lose sight of the person whose holiness we carry. He's the only reason we can even approach the throne or speak to the Father, and one day we'll inherit heaven. He's the reason for the season. It's trite, but let's not waste it. This opportunity of this placement, when we have been given the perfect time and place to preach the gospel. Let's stand and sing.